Okay, today we're going to make a pie crust, and it's the holiday time here, but I'm not sure when you're watching this. Pies are good throughout the year for either sweets or for meat pies. Today we're going to make pies for our Thanksgiving season, and the pies that we're making today will be pumpkin pie, pecan pie, and apple pie. So we're going to use the same pie crust for all of them, so I'm going to make the first two crusts now. And we're going to need flour, 2½ cups of flour, 3/4 cup of shortening, and I use the shortening that's already pre-measured into the blocks. So I just sliced off 3/4 of a cup, a ½ teaspoon of salt, and 6 to 7 tablespoons of water. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add the flour, 2½ cups, to my bowl. Then I'm going to add a ½ teaspoon of salt. And then I'm just going to stir that together to mix the salt thoroughly. Then my next step is going to be to add the shortening, and I'm going to cut that in. And if you haven't done this before, basically cutting the shortening in, you're going to use, if you have it, you want to use a pastry cutter. If you don't have it, you could use 2 knives and cut them across from each other until you get it in there, but you'll see what I'm talking about. This is a lot easier if you have the tool. And you're just cutting it over and over again inside the flour until it's the consistency of coarse sand. Might be little pea-sized balls of it. There'll be some loose flour still that's loose in there, but most of it's the kind of like it's sandy. So can you see that's kind of sandy in there? None of the big pieces are there. There's some that are more the size of a pea, and then most of them are more like grains of sand. And then there's still some loose flour too, and that's fine. So then our next step, I have 7 tablespoons of cold water inside this cup with the tablespoon measure. And I'm going to add a tablespoon at a time until I can stir it into a dough ball that will start to stick together. I don't want to use too much water or it'll just be a soupy mess. But I do want to have enough that it can mold together. And I'm just going to sprinkle it across the top. And because I know that I need quite a few, I'm going to start with 2 tablespoons. I'm just going to stir it through to start mixing it in. Then I'll do that again. I don't know if you can tell because of the color, but it's starting to stick into larger clumps. And I'm just kind of breaking those up with a fork, but I'm watching to see when it starts to stick together easier. It doesn't have to be a big ball or anything. You just want to be able to push it into a ball. A touch more and then that should be plenty. So it looks like I used probably about 6 tablespoons total for this batch. But depending on your humidity and your flour and everything else, you can't count on that. So go by texture and look at it and make sure that it feels right. Okay, so now I'm going to form it into a ball. And then I'm going to divide it into 2, because this is going to make 2 9-inch pie crusts. And now that I feel it, I think I want to add just a touch more. It just felt a little bit dry. I know you can't see that on the camera, but it felt a little bit dry, and I thought I'd just add a little bit more to make it bind a little bit better. that feels better. So I'm going to cut that into 2 pieces. And then I'm going to roll this first one into the first circle for my first pie. One of the pies that I'm making will be a deep dish, one will not be. Really doesn't matter. You'll have a little bit of extra no matter what. Alright, so I could have just rolled the dough onto my counter, but I like to use this plastic mat. This one's by Tupperware. There are different ones that you can buy from different companies, and most cooking areas have something like this. To keep it from slipping when I'm rolling on it, I put a wet paper towel underneath it and I wrung it out so it's just slightly damp. And then I'm going to take my first pie plate and see where it falls on here. If I didn't have this, then I could just kind of get an idea of how big I needed it to be. But I know I want to roll it beyond this because the pie crust is going to need to fold into the pie. So it looks like it's about the right size. And it is sticky, so you have to kind of poke with it. If it gets too much than you can handle, you could sprinkle a little bit of flour on to keep it from sticking. But my concern with doing that today was I want it to be really light and flaky. And if I add too much flour to it, then it's going to be tough. And I'm trying to keep it as crispy as I can. So to take a pie crust off, you want to lightly roll it onto your rolling pin. And you could use a little scraper or spatula if you need to do this part. And then I'm going to unroll it across my pie plate. And then just reposition it as you need to. And just gently fold it into the pie plate. This is my deep dish pan, so it's going to take a little bit more crust than it would on the other one. So I'm just kind of feeling it to make sure there's no air bubbles underneath it, because when I go to bake it, I don't want to have big air bubbles there. And then because this is a single crust pie, it's not a double crust pie, I'm going to go ahead and flute the edges. And to flute them, I just kind of pinch them in. Take off, if there's a thick spot like this, you can always put that somewhere else on it. So then to flute it, you just kind of, that's when you, it kind of has a wavy section to it. So I'm just going to pinch it in and out. The other thing you could do is to crimp the edges. You could take a fork and use the tines of the fork to push it down against the edge. And I may do that on my next one. Alright, so there's my first crust. And before you fill a crust or bake it, you always want to prick the bottom a little bit so that the air can escape and so you don't have huge bubbles coming up and pushing your filling up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that so that this is ready for the pumpkin pie that will go into it later. If I were going to pre-bake this to make a pre-baked pie crust, then I would go ahead and bake it now. And that would go in at 425 degrees for 10 minutes for a partially baked crust and 18 minutes for a fully baked crust. So I'm going to set this one aside and we're going to do the next one. So this crust I'm going to use my fork to crimp the edges to show you the difference. So it just adds a little bit of a edge to it. And then again, I'll prick the bottom like I did on the other, and it'll be ready for our pecan pie filling. Well, good luck making yours. I'd love to hear your comments below and how yours turned out. Thanks for watching.